So if we take the epistles of John here and look at kind of their argumentation as a whole, what is what do these epistles bring to the New Testament that is kind of unique or would be absent if they were missing?
So one, I think they address some of the heresy that was going on at the time that isn't as fully addressed anywhere else. Some I think dealing with the Nicolaitans in places and things of this sort, and those who are kind of given over to satisfying selfish desires and still somehow able to say that they were good and things of this sort. And he contrasts, he kind of describes that as this is the world. That's what the world does. The world satisfies their selfish desires, and pits that against loving God, and says you can't really love the world and love God at the same time. And he makes it really stark. And I guess maybe that's one of the things he brings and makes it crystal clear.
In speaking of some of the heresies that were going on, it's interesting that there were some views at the time of that the physical world is evil in itself, and therefore it's kind of an illusion. And Jesus didn't have a physical body because that would have made him evil, and so that was an illusion. And everything is spiritual, and everything is the world is just illusory, and so it seems like you could think about John in those kinds of terms because he's talking about love, he's talking about light. He's not maybe being as practical as James. And so it seems like an odd way to address maybe the problems of the time. You would think that maybe a book like James would better address these issues. Why is it that John's taken this tack in addressing this, and how is it that these people who believed in the evilness of the flesh ended up becoming very hedonistic, and there seem to be a lot of contradictions going on here.
Well, you know what? I think it might be the most effective way to kind of reach the person who's kind of steeped in that philosophy is to kind of meet them on their own terms, meet them on their own grounds. I'm reminded of Paul kind of at Athens doing the same thing and saying, I can see that you guys are religious, and talking about all their idols and stuff like that. He says, however, but uses that kind of as the way to reach them. And maybe John is doing the same thing here. And maybe this was a more effective way to accomplish that than a James kind of practical, book. Unfortunately, once they have adopted the mindset that the physical world is evil, but also that they came to the conclusion that it's almost inconsequential, that whatever happens in it doesn't matter, and whatever happens in the spiritual, in my spirit, that's what matters. And all of a sudden they could justify satisfying their hedonistic desires because it doesn't matter. It doesn't. It's completely inconsequential to anything.
And so we find that the doctrine of the incarnation becomes incredibly important very early on. And it's interesting, once again, that doctrine becomes very important in John, who seems to be very esoteric, and maybe not as much in James, which is very practical. And so there's all these apparent contradictions running around here. So for John, why would the incarnation be so important when he sees so much value in these ideas of light and love and those kinds of things?
One, it completely dispels the notion that the physical doesn't matter, if you will. It's interesting that in John's gospel, he starts it off, and John 1 parallels Genesis 1. And it's Genesis 1 that tells us that when God created man, he saw that it was good. And it was a melding of the physical and the spiritual, and God saw that it was good. So to come away with this idea, millennia later, that the physical is bad, is in direct contradiction, and I think John would be in a key place to see that. And so in the incarnation, you once again see this melding of the physical with the spiritual, and it's very good. and this great place to kind of fight against the heresy that's going on here.
It seems that John is kind of saying here that all these spiritual ideas, they can't be divorced from the physical reality. That yes, these are very spiritual ideas of light and love, but they have a very practical and a very physical manifestation to them. And so for John, it doesn't seem to be any kind of contradiction to have this kind of esoteric view of life and a very practical view of life and meld them together. But yet, historically, these things haven't come together very easily. And even within the church, there's been a hard time combining these two things. It seems like you're in the very practical camp or you're in the hippie camp. So why is it so hard to bring these two things together? And have we figured that out in the modern world? Is this a problem of a bygone era?
No, this is something we still struggle with today, and I think, in a sense, even James kind of hit this with the whole faith and works. And the faith we might kind of think of as in the spiritual realm, and then the works part is more in the physical realm. But it's one of those things that, your faith, what you believe, is always going to manifest itself in the physical. The spiritual always manifests itself in the physical, and it's one of those things. If we choose, to sin, and we know it's a sin. That is not a good thing. But when I believe in something, not only, it's not that I'm making a choice to sin against my conscience. If I believe in a certain way, I'm actually going to repeat that sin over and over again and never wound my conscience, potentially.
There seems to be something important about the physical world and the ability to suffer. We see that as a great negative. And for obvious reasons. I mean, nobody wants to suffer. But what part does suffering play in all of this? Because I think, that's one of the ways that John's gospel and his view here in his epistles kind of differs from the hippie view. What role does suffering play in this?
Yeah, I don't know if I can sum it up into a nice package with a bow here, but suffering is, in part one, it's the evidence of the reality. It's funny, somebody can say they love you, and you'll never know that it's actually true more than when somebody's willing to suffer for you. But it's not just that. It's not just that's the purpose of suffering. It's just that you can really know if you love somebody or something. Right. But there's more to it. There's you can call it purifying in a sense, and that's true, but it's still not going to sum up the value of it.
It seems like that suffering in some ways is kind of the currency of value. It's hard to imagine how you would show the value of something without some kind of suffering. I'm trying to even figure out what that would look like. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and you might say, well, you could show the value by putting up a large sum of money, but what is money? It's stored up toil and suffering, if you will.
Right. Yeah, and so John here ends up, even though it seems like a very esoteric book, I think there's a lot of practicality to that, and I think it addresses a lot of what our current culture struggles with.